Okay, so I would like to welcome you back to the last presentation paper of the afternoon, Darian Meacham, who will speak to us on epoche and institution.
Thank you.
So, Darian Meacham is professor at the University of Bristol, the West of England. The only
it's
West.
Important to get all the articles.
The only West is the West of England.
Yes.
East Anglia?
No, that's a whole other place. That's
somewhere in England called the West,
of
in
England.
a town called Bristol.
Yes.
He is a professor there. So, Darian, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nicholas, for organizing this and inviting me. I think I invited myself to some extent. So thanks for organizing it and tolerating my self-indulgence. And thanks to all of you for sticking around to the bitter end of what has turned into a sunny afternoon. There's a handout making its way around. I see it's almost there. So I wanted to start, I wrote a paper, which I'll get to in a moment, and then I realized that my paper really said nothing about Europe, which was disturbing for me, as it's supposed to be a workshop on Patočka and Europe. But luckily, the theme of Europe is never very far from Patočka's concerns, and so I saw quickly that what I was concerned with was another way that Patočka spoke about Europe, and another way in which he was concerned about Europe. So I'll just start very briefly by reading to you these two quotes. They're both from the Plato in Europe, and I think both from the first lecture of Plato in Europe. The first is, care for the soul is, I think, a central theme around which, I think I misquoted here, put the I think twice, around which the life plan of Europe crystallized. Now our task is to determine what the soul means, and what is meant by care for the soul. And then one page earlier, you know perhaps what I want to say. Can care for the soul, which is the fundamental heritage of Europe, still speak to us today? Speak to us who need to find something to lean on in this common agreement about decline, in this weakness, in this consent to the fall. So those are all themes that we've discussed throughout the day, and I'm going to pick those themes up, but in a slightly, I think, more phenomenological register than they've been worked over so far. I want to start by giving just a very general framework of the the project in which I'm taking up these ideas. So I'm interested, in one sense, in exploring and developing the relationship between Patočka's phenomenology and Patočka's political thought. And then more specifically to the context of this talk or this paper, I'm interested in elaborating the role and the significance of the idea of epoche in Patočka's conception of the political and of the polis, and then, as we'll see, in relation to the idea of care for the soul. A little bit more broadly speaking, I'm interested in asking what resources Patočka's political phenomenology or developments of it or from it might be able to bring in addressing rather concrete philosophical and political challenges surrounding the European political scene, and more generally, Europe, the very idea, which is a shameless plug for the conference that we're hosting in May, entitled just that. Importantly for me is to try to not lose sight, actually, of the sort of continuous interdependence of the concrete and the abstract, not only in Patočka's thought, but also in addressing problems of Europe or surrounding the European political scene. And I think I realize that I make an almost conscious effort to do that in a naive fashion, actually. And what I mean by that is everybody sort of raises their eyebrows and quietly looks away when you say things like, the proper task of the European Parliament is care for the soul. That makes everyone uncomfortable. That makes people who like to talk about care for the soul uncomfortable, and that certainly makes people who like to talk about the European Parliament uncomfortable. They always say, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'm really sorry I'm busy on those days. It's sort of
I have a meeting.
But I think there's some benefit in taking that rather naive approach or hard-headed approach to it in a certain sense. Because I think, in a way, these questions are fundamental to what Europe is about, or what the European project is about. Okay, so I have a paper to read to you, and it's, I think, far too long. I tried to cut it down as much as I could. At the end, I was really just sort of hacking at it with the delete key. But I hope it all still holds together. At the end of my handout, there's 3 points or questions for development. I'm not trying to, no, actually I am trying to constrain the discussion, but I'm sure I'll fail in doing that. But I pose those 3 questions or those 3 points because honestly I need help with them. Because I'm not sure. So those are things that I'm interested in talking about. And it's certainly not the limit of what we can talk about. All right, so I'm going to read to you my talk here. And Nicholas said at the very beginning that we should really conduct this in the style of an informal workshop. If you want to interrupt, please do, actually. And no problem with that. As I said, it's a long paper, a little bit too long. So if you feel the need, just shout stop at me, and we can stop and talk about something for a little while. All right. So the contention of this talk is that Patočka's reformulation of the idea of the phenomenological epoche plays a central, though often implicit, role in his political thinking, and most specifically in his conception of the polis. And what I want to contend is that for Patočka, the hard core of the political as a sphere of life can be understood as both the site and indeed the activity of the epoche, or an epoche. And in this sense, the polis itself must be understood as co-originary with the activity of the epoche. But the emphasis on the epoche as the political activity par excellence creates a tension with any conception of political institutions, and more broadly speaking, with the polis itself as an institution. And this is for the simple reason that the political epoche that Patočka has in mind is always a suspension of the validity and even disassembling of institutions qua historically stable meaning structures. This tension can, of course, be detected throughout Patočka's work, in his more phenomenological writings, in the philosophy of history, and also in the political works. And he's certainly aware of this tension, and moreover, contrary to trying to resolve the tension, he seems to understand it as, in a sense, constitutive of his overall philosophical problem and project. Hence the title of my paper, Epoche and Institution. So I think that placing the epoche at the center of a theory of the political has some important ramifications for how we should think about the structure and the role of both what we would normally call political institutions, so things like parliaments, and what we might call pre-political institutions. And there I have in mind things like health and educational services. There's always a little bit of a problem when you start using these words in relation to Patočka. So properly speaking for Patočka, this would all be pre-political. So none of these types of institutions would be properly political. But I'm going to try to shift and be clear about when I shift from the sort of normal usage of these terms to a more Patočkian usage of the terms. So as a result of this, the significance of the relation between epoche and institution, I think, in Patočka's thought, extends beyond our interest merely in what Patočka has to say or the work of one philosopher, but has concrete relevance for how we should think about the relation between the political as both an abstract and a concrete concept and political institutions. I.e., if the central task of the political per se is to undermine the certainty and stability of the polis's own institutions, how can those institutions maintain themselves in anything like what we might recognize as a polis? So what I'm going to present to you today will make a case in favor of a political rendering of the phenomenological epoche as Patočka develops it. The second part of this essay, so not of the talk but of the essay, which I won't present to you mostly because I'm stuck. The second part, the idea of that is to look closer at the tension between epoche and institution in the understanding of the polis, and specifically look closer at the seeming preclusion of institutionalization or normalization in Patočka's account of the political, the limiting of the solidarity of the shaken to saying no to mobilization. Ultimately, I'm trying to suggest, or I'd like to work towards something like a tripartite structure of the polis that doesn't, in fact, resolve the tension between epoche and institution, but allows for it to be maintained precisely as the constitutive dimension of the political. And I think that this tripartite structure of the polis is, to some degree at least, in line with Patočka's understanding of the three movements of human life. And I see it, although it's undeveloped, as containing three levels of institution: life-sustaining and supporting political institutions, i.e. what we would normally call political institutions. And then these two would create a space for what we might call something like a deinstitutionalizing institution, i.e. the political epoche. And it's this institution that would constitute the proper sense of the term polis. And here is my naivete at its worst. To be a bit naive and perhaps provocative, the closest I can imagine to a concrete and iterable instantiation of this perhaps lies in the idea, or the ideal, of a European Parliament. So taking a broader view, the analyses below will not show not only, or the analysis that I'll try to develop will show not only a proximity between Patočka's phenomenology and his political thought, but really interdependence. Phenomenology for Patočka becomes inherently political from the moment that we understand the proper site of care for the soul, i.e. the proper activity of philosophy, from the moment we understand that that proper site is the polis. The reverse is, of course, also true. Politics must be understood as inherently phenomenological. And taken at face value, I don't think this is really a major claim or a great leap. It seems almost obvious that the political is largely to do with the manner in which other people and communities appear to us, and how we appear to ourselves in relation to these others. Politics, very broadly speaking, is about intersubjective relations and the institutions that structure them. What my interpretation of Patočka claims is that the properly political activity in this phenomenological sense implies a specific relation or coming into contact with the world and its processes of manifestation. And that relation is best described through the idea of epoche, albeit a reformulation of Husserl's understanding. And so, of course, there's a flip side to this as well, and that's that the way into phenomenology, and specifically the way into the epoche, can be construed as being through the political, in terms of the concrete institution of the polis. So the first part of my talk will make the case for placing the epoche at the center of Patočka's political thought. And I'm then going to try to explain the link first established by Husserl between the phenomenological epoche and the idea of conversion, and look at how this functions in the political sphere. I'll then address the problem of motivation to undergo the political epoche in terms of Patočka's concepts of shaking and of front. In the final section of this talk, we'll ask, what is the residuum of the political epoche? So the link, so the first part, placing the epoche at the center of the political. The link between the epoche and the political is primarily established in the heretical essays, in the philosophy of history, and in the lectures that we've discussed, Plato and Europe. Though the epoche is not explicitly discussed in the main sections of either of these texts, for, I think, what are sort of historical reasons, or reasons of the context of these texts, the audience that they were addressed to. But what is made clear in Plato and Europe is that the question of care for the soul, which is the primary focus of these lectures, is at its core a question of manifestation, or appearance, and particularly the appearance of the world or world structure. Care for the soul is a phenomenological activity, but it is also the political activity. Patočka tells his friends and students, I quote, "From the cultivating of our soul arises the possibility of forming a state, the community that is necessary so that a person like Socrates does not need to die." You see then that the question of the polis and its constitution, its constituting, is again the question of the soul, its character and its examination, care for the soul. End quote. So I think the concept of the soul should be understood in this concept phenomenologically, as the field of appearances. And Patočka, to an extent, legitimizes this interpretation in Plato and Europe when he writes that the soul stands at the boundary of the visible and the invisible. And then he informs his listeners that naturally the soul under consideration is not the soul of the individual, but rather the soul of the world. In the author's glosses to the heretical essays, there's a direct reference to the relation between the phenomenological and the political. Patočka writes, "The question of human social being is in the first place a phenomenological question." What is it about the particular manner in which Patočka approaches phenomenology and the epoche in particular that is so important for his understanding of the political and the proper construction of the polis? So I think this relation can be put in the following manner. 1, the question of the polis is the question of care for the soul. 2, for Patočka, the term soul primarily refers to the world structure as its field of appearance. The soul, qua world or field of appearance, is discovered and interrogated in terms of its constituent processes of manifestation under the epoche. It's interrogated under the epoche. This concept of soul can also be thought of as the boundary between the visible and the invisible, or the manifest and the non-manifest. And thus, I think it includes both the world as an a priori horizon of all manifestation and as the field of manifestation. Moreover, the soul as the boundary between the visible and the invisible concerns the relations between the world structure in its two senses, and being as the movement of appearance between the poles of retreat and non-retreat. Being, in this sense, is the movement by which individual existence come to appear against an a priori horizon of the world structure. It is the coming to be of phenomena. Hence, the soul becomes the site of this coming to be. The proper polis is, in this sense, a particular type of soul. A soul that is interrogated in terms of its constituent processes of phenomena coming to be. And care for the soul is another name for the active interrogation of the coming to be of phenomena, and in some cases the active intervention in this coming to be. And this interrogation or intervention is another way of talking about the political epoche. The question, so 3, the question of the soul is a question of the relation between humans and manifesting as such. So that leads us to ask, why humans and why a world soul and not an individual soul? And simply put, I think it's because for Patočka, qua phenomenologist, the world is an intersubjective accomplishment. The world coming to be what it is for our individual souls is a social activity. Or, put more precisely, the manifesting of the world, the proper activity of the soul, is constitutive of individual subjectivities and individual souls. Again, we find this point made in Plato in Europe. I quote, "Care for the soul is fundamentally care that follows from the proximity of man to appearing, manifesting, to the phenomenon as such, to the manifesting of the world in its whole." If we compare this to the following remark, I quote, "The question of the polis is again the question of the soul," end quote. "The relation between polis, care for the soul, and appearing is established." Now we can look at how Patočka, in the discussion of appearance in Plato in Europe, describes the relation to the originary category of appearance in the natural attitude. I quote, "In our daily life, showing is the ground upon which life constantly moves. But at the same time, showing as such does not in the least interest us. Things interest us, in what, which, and how they are. We are interested in what shows itself, in our practical orientation and our cognizing. Showing phenomenon that on the basis of which things are for us, what they are, is itself constantly hidden from us. The attention to the category of appearing is a shift out of the natural attitude. And I think that it is the proper activity, thus, of the polis. Thus, we can call the polis, or the political, a shift away from the natural attitude. So the political here as an activity is precisely the bringing to the fore and interrogation of showing as a process. The question of the relation between the political and the epoche is thus the question of how what the epoche reveals about the relation between phenomena, appearing, the world, and being can then be applied to its proper site, the polis, as the proper scene of collective life. And what are the consequences of this phenomenological analysis for the place of the concrete polis within the natural attitude? That is, within the cultural, historical life worlds that individuated subjects are situated in. Another way of saying this would be that the question of the polis becomes for Patočka the question of the relation between the natural attitude and the phenomenological. And specifically, what are the consequences for the sense and stability of the historical political institutions that the epoche brackets? What does the epoche do to our historically constituted and transmitted political institutions? If we follow Patočka's analysis, it rips them apart. Describing the discovery of the political, he writes in heretical essays, all the pillars of community, tradition, myth are equally shaken, as are all the answers that once preceded questions. So I think that while Patočka's thought does bear the mark of Heidegger's contention that the polis is the site of history, it also retains, in this emphasis on the epoche, a more Husserlian emphasis on the grounding of historical humanity in the rigorous science of phenomenology and specifically of the epoche. The shaken certitude of pre-given meaning opens up the possibility of an interrogation of the process of meaning formation, i.e., it opens up the possibility of phenomenology as the descriptive science of meaning formation. The political residue of this rendering of the epoche is, in fact, the community of phenomenologists, bound perhaps by their intersubjective interrogation of the processes of manifestation, and perhaps most importantly, by the interrogation of the manifestation of those institutions that play an infrastructural role to the overall sense arising. By that I mean precisely the institutions of the polis, both the political and the pre-political ones. So, second part then, epoche as conversion. It may seem odd then that in his descriptions of this rigorous science, Patočka follows Husserl in using a term more frequently associated with a religious context, conversion. A polis, in this strong sense, emerges where individuals, citizens, undergo in a collective action a movement from the pre-political to the political, from the prehistorical to the historical, or from the natural attitude to the phenomenological. In this movement, the givenness of a world, or of the world, as a meaningful whole, and in particular the givenness of human social relations in their relation to this whole, is, to use Patočka's term, problematized in what he calls a metanoesis, or a conversion of historic proportions. I quote from the heretical essays there. The use of this term, conversion, echoes Husserl's use of the same idea to describe the epoche in paragraph 35 of The Crisis. And in his commentary on Husserl's Crisis, James Dodd explains the idea of conversion in relation to the epoche and discovery of the phenomenological attitude in the following manner. So I quote Dodd, "Like the epoche, a conversion is a shift that transforms the meaning of the whole. In this sense, it is not one vocation among others, but something that redefines the sense of the whole of life within which all activities are pursued." End quote. And the same idea applies to Patočka's idea of the epoche as a political conversion. It redefines the sense of the whole and as such impacts all aspects of human experience. The political in this way, in this sense, goes all the way down. Even our metabolizing bodies are politicized in this conversion. But Patočka's understanding of the political and the polis in this sense is not only descriptive, it also provides a normative frame for political action. As it was for Husserl, the conversion of phenomenology is for Patočka the way out of two forms of nihilism marking the 20th century. I quote Patočka here from the heretical essays. "Today's polarized world might seem at times like a battlefield of two nihilisms in Nietzsche's sense of the word. The nihilism of those hampered by inconsistent remnants of antiquated meaning, and those who unscrupulously carry out the transvaluation of all values from the standpoint of strength and power." This could, of course, be seen as a more extreme rendering of Husserl's understanding of philosophy as a rigorous science being threatened on two sides. On the one hand, the Weltanschauungsphilosophie, and on the other, crude physicalist naturalism. Patočka thinks that this view of the contemporary world is in fact mistaken, and it's important to note then that he's writing roughly 40 years after the Crisis and more than 60 years after Husserl's philosophy as a rigorous science. The conservative politics and philosophy of Weltanschauung represent only a reactionary and futile resistance to what he calls elsewhere the metaphysics of force, the reduction of all being to an economics of energy production and consumption, or, as he says elsewhere, echoing Heidegger to an extent, the massification of all life under the perilous form of industrial production. If the road to the polis leads through a conversion, we must investigate more precisely what this conversion means. So the idea of conversion is introduced by Husserl in the Crisis in the discussion of the phenomenological epoche as it stands in relation to the other vocational epoche. And the idea of a vocational epoche implies that we, quote Husserl, establish in ourselves just one particular habitual direction of interest with a certain vocational attitude. In this sense, for example, the proper activities of the cobbler, the natural scientist, the father, those are Husserl's examples, and even the citizen, all have their vocational time in which other concerns not linked to the specific activity and its specific forms of validity are bracketed. To use Husserl's examples, the cobbler is not concerned with the molecular structure of the leather, but rather its suppleness. The father not concerned with how the leather was treated, but with his child's aching foot. The phenomenological epoche is both similar and radically different from these other forms of vocational epoche. The time of the phenomenological epoche is on the one hand distinct from other activities. One cannot simultaneously engage in the practice of the natural sciences, or perhaps even cobbling, while under a phenomenological epoche which suspends the validity of its formal objects, here I'm thinking of natural sciences, not cobbling, in favor of an investigation of the genesis of those same validities. In this way, the phenomenological epoche has its own working hours, or vocational time. But it's also radically different in that despite having its own working hours, its scope is global. It consists in a transformation of the thematic consciousness of the world, which breaks through the normality of straightforward living. That's quoting Husserl. It establishes, and I quote Husserl again, a consistent universal interest in the how of the manners of givenness and in the onta themselves, not straightforwardly, but rather as objects in respect to their how. That is, with our interest exclusively and constantly directed toward how. Throughout the alteration of relative validities, subjective appearance, and opinion, the coherent universal validity world, the world, comes into being for us. That's Husserl from the Crisis. This habitual interest in the how of manners of appearing must, of course, be limited for the reasons stated above, but it also has a transforming effect on the person who trains themselves to see the world in this fashion. To go from seeing the world as constituted to seeing the very processes of constituting that allow for a world to appear in the first place. Within working hours, it's clear to see that this changes everything and nothing, so to speak. All previous accomplishments or entities remain in place before us, but our interest in them changes. It shifts precisely to the how of their constitution. But in the case of phenomenology as a vocation, it's hard to leave your work at the office. The awareness of the world as being an accomplishment of various processes of constitution, rather than simply given, has a transformative effect on all aspects of life. Like after a religious conversion, the phenomenologist, or perhaps eventually the citizen, having undergone the epoche, never again sees the world or her place in it in the same way. This conversion does not only hold significance at the personal level. What we come to see upon the shift to the interest in the how of modes of appearing is that the world is precisely a social accomplishment. Its constitution is always a co-constitution, carried out through an ongoing process of intersubjective verification, of which the natural sciences are a formalized extension, as is phenomenology, as the science charged with the interrogation of the processes of intersubjective co-constitution and verification. In an important manner, politics is also a formalized extension of this process, insofar as politics is largely about the constitution and management of various kinds of institutions. For example, a national origin myth, or an educational system, bricks, mortar, and all. These kinds of institutions serve as infrastructural support, or as what I'm calling infrastructural support, for certain modes of givenness. For example, a national myth or institution may provide infrastructural support for the appearance of a community boundary, the appearance of a compatriot and foreigner along whatever lines, linguistic, ethnic, class, etc. How the institutions of education are constituted. Structures, for example, how the physical territory occupied by a community appears. For example, if it appears as a homeland in a strong sense, or if it appears as a collection of empirical facts presenting themselves as value neutral. These kinds of institutions require ongoing intersubjective verification and support. But this in fact holds for all meaning structures in the world. And it is in this sense that the task of the phenomenological epoche in interrogating the how of the appearance of the world takes on its sense as a collective task. The task for the community of phenomenologists, and ultimately, Husserl says, a task for mankind as such. And I'll try to state the case below, I'll try to argue below that, or further on, that Patočka gives a more radical rendering of this idea when he introduces the concept of the solidarity of the shaken. So, next part, the shaking and the front. So if the political can be understood as epoche in these terms, that is, if the hard core of the political activity does not entail the construction and maintenance of institutions, but rather a radical interrogation that suspends, if not destroys, their validity qua formal objects and forms of life, then Patočka's theory faces a similar problem of motivation to Husserl's. If the meaning structures that show themselves to us do so in the manner of stable givenness, i.e. as being real or true, what motivation would there be to interrogate their processes of appearing? In the context of our discussion here, the shift from the natural pre-political to the phenomenological political attitude must then be motivated by factors within the pre-political. And we find in Patočka's analyses various aspects of pre-historical or pre-political life which function as motivating factors for the properly phenomenological political attitude. But foremost, at least in our own period, is the experience that Patočka calls shaking. And I think that shaking as an operative concept in Patočka's thought is nearly synonymous with the idea of the epoche in terms of a bracketing or suspension of the validity of any pre-given historical sense, i.e. institutions, that form on particular communities. The experience of being shaken thrusts the subject into the harsh light of the political properly understood. But shaking as a process commences in the natural pre-political attitude. Another way to put this is to say that to be shaken is to undergo a forced conversion, after which none of the institutions of our pre-political lives retain their stability. And what I would argue is that the central challenge of the political, a challenge intrinsic to the meaning of the political itself, is precisely to maintain this specifically political form of the epoche, precisely to maintain the state of being shaken. The paradigmatic modern experience of shaking in Patočka's late writing is the experience of the soldier at the front line. And of course, as we've discussed, he's thinking explicitly here about the trench warfare of the First World War. Now, war plays an important role in Patočka's thought, and it's not the appropriate context to discuss how quite he understands the centrality of war to the 20th century. But I think it's safe to say that Patočka would agree with Clausewitz's dictum that war is politics carried out by other means. What this means, of course, is that war is the extension of one form of nihilism and its eventual transformation and being enveloped into another. In the first instance, war is a conflict of rival or incompatible pre-political institutions. What makes the First World War so significant for Patočka is that the unforeseen scale of this initial pre-political institutional conflict forces its protagonists to fully mobilize entire nations and populations for the war effort, and to do so in an unprecedented manner. Mobilization in this sense refers to or requires the reduction of all life to an economy of energy or metaphysics of force, the nihilism of the domination of technoscience over all aspects of being. And just briefly note, Adam Hochschild, in the book that I mentioned earlier, which is To End All Wars, which is a book about dissidents during the First World War, he notes that the decisive realization on the part of the military and political leaders in the First World War was that this war was no longer going to be decided in terms of bravery or superior strategy, And he tells these ongoing stories about all these officers, all these cavalrymen, waiting for the charge when they were going to be able to show their wonderful strategy and the wonderful horse formations that they had developed in previous conflicts, and the moment simply never came, and they ended up just sitting at the front for years and years. The realization, of course, was that the war would not be won in this way, but by industrial productivity and the longevity of the protagonists. And this led to the war transforming entire nations, really, into metabolic systems or war machines, in a manner of speaking. But this situation, what Patočka calls the metaphysics of force, does not recede following the cessation of hostilities. In fact, it continues to expand and reinforce its hold on life, even in peacetime. War is the continuation of politics by other means, but the result is that politics, in fact, after World War I, becomes the continuation of war by other means. Post-World War I politics for Patočka are in the service of the metaphysics of force, i.e. the management of an economy of energy, translated in terms of production and consumption. The other side of this is that war, as the continuation of politics, entirely uproots or rips apart the natural pre-political world of the historically founded communities as horizons of sense. And in doing so, by shaking the community to its foundations, in Patočka's terms, war becomes a motivating factor for the political epoche. So what happens to the life world at the front, and by extension, under the interpretation of the epoche as front? Well, we can start with what Patočka in the Heretical Essays calls the first phase, and it's really this phase which is properly bracketing or suspension. And I quote, "The first phase is the experience of meaninglessness and unbearable horror. The front line is absurdity par excellence, that all that humans hold most precious is torn to shreds." Now, this is, of course, not a methodological bracketing, but rather an involuntary disintegration of the meaning structures of the life world in terms of a particular world of historically transmitted cultural sense, and in terms of the life world as a universal structure of all cultural worlds. So what's lost at the front is not merely our own home world in the sense of a historical cultural horizon, but also the structure providing for the establishment of intersubjective relative horizons of meaning, which constitute our cultural worlds. In the third heretical essay, Patočka writes, "Perhaps the most terrifying experience of meaninglessness is that presented by the devastation of partial meaningfulness, by the catastrophe of societies and spiritual worlds painstakingly built up over generations." And this is precisely what is being described as the phenomenon of the front. What's important here is that what's bracketed or destroyed, and we need to retain both senses in the shaking of the front, are not only individual subjective horizons or individual aspects of a more generalized cultural life world. It's not just the individual meaning structure that is, for example, the university library, to use a local example, that is destroyed, but rather it's what I've called politically infrastructural meaning structures. And the life world qua home world as a whole is destroyed. As a whole, as what, in terms, Patočka uses the terms, total horizons of spiritual worlds built up over generations. So there's, of course, a link between the destruction of individual meaning structures or entities, university libraries, and the total horizon of a spiritual world. And I think, at least for me, it may be helpful to understand this idea of a total horizon of a spiritual world as a gestalt structure of sorts. So it's constituted or instituted diacritically in the constellation of all its parts, but yet exceeding them and giving them their sense. And this total horizon cannot survive the destruction of its particulars, or perhaps better, there's a threshold of destruction that it cannot survive. But the reverse is also true. The particular or individuated meaning horizons of things cannot withstand the disintegration of the whole. One example of this would be the way that an antique vase appears, a vase appears, and is of interest to us as a relic or as a component of a world that is no longer, as a horizon of sense, functional. The materiality of the destruction that took place at the front of the First World War should not be underplayed here. Really was whole landscapes that had once been dotted with centuries-old towns and villages were obliterated. literally reduced to holes in the ground or traces of rubble. And Patočka's analysis of the particularity of the frontline experience, or his analyses of this, are in a sense in accord with Arendt's comments in The Human Condition about the relation between products of work, i.e. durable artifacts, and the possibility of having a world at all. I quote Arendt, "The products of work, not the products of labor, guarantee the permanence and durability without which a world would not be possible at all." So that leaves us with the final question about what is the residuum of the political epoche. And in the descriptions of frontline experience, Patočka's prose draws heavily on Junger and Teilhard de Chardin, and it takes on a somewhat mystical tone. And I'm going to forego for the most part those descriptions here, but I'm going to note two aspects of the experience which are common to both of those accounts, and follow them from the phenomenological line that I've been trying to pursue. First of all, the frontline experience marks a fundamental transformation of human existence, a conversion. And second, from the destruction of all meaning and destruction of historical communities, literally reduced to rubble over the course of single battles, Patočka writes, "The person at the front line is gradually overcome by an overwhelming sense of meaningfulness." At the front line, a whole world is destroyed. It's not an interrogation, but an eradication of landmarks, of culture, of all physical objects. And with this, it is a shaking or suspension of the subject itself, which is held in place and granted its stability by that of the world. Thus, the residuum of the shaking of the front is not the subject in its absolute constituting power and activity, but rather for Patočka merely a perspective upon a field of appearance. And this field of appearance opens before the perspective as a field of possibilities of manifestation of a world. At points, Patočka refers to the animal that has a perceptual field and a field of action. He writes, "The unity of the animal equals being possible." That's from the phenomenological papers. The reference to animality underlines the importance of embodiment and of movement. The residuum of the political epoche is an embodied perspective upon a field of appearance that by dint of the possible movement of the perspective in relation to its pragmatic engagement with the field around it, is also a field of possible manifestations. It's by moving, being oriented by practical and value-laden poles of engagement, that things qua meaning structures come into the world. Being as this movement of appearance must be understood in terms of the movement of the body, which in its engagement with the field of possibilities brings the world into being. But the movement of the body, which correlates to a movement of being, is not a solitary activity. Our movement only has sense from another perspective that we do not occupy. For this reason, the appearance of the world and its stability or verification must pass through the others with whom I engage and interact. And what is left on a battlefield where all else is destroyed, but in fact the other soldiers. And we might say that the first meaning structure towards which the moving body is oriented is the other, or from another section of Patočka's writing, is the mother, in fact. This process of bringing a world to appearance through movement is also defining of the subject itself, which, like all other objects, defines and delimits itself in relation to all other things in the world. Muscular movement is the individuation of the subject from the field of possibilities of which it is a part. The subject becomes an actualized possibility in this field, but also takes distance from it. And this delimitation and individuation includes, of course, the sense of the moving body itself. The sense of the body is not a given, but is itself an individuation within the field of possibility. And that's why I said above that in the epoche, all meaning, even that of the metabolizing body, is shaken. The meaningfulness that Patočka refers could be thought, the meaningfulness to which Patočka refers could be thought of in this manner, as a discovery of both freedom and responsibility over the manifestation of the world. And Patočka understands freedom not as residing in the projection of possibilities, but in the assuming of responsibility for the movement that creates the sense of the world. Freedom in this sense is in this way both made possible and constrained by embodied movement and the others in relation to whom I move and comport myself. What Patočka emphasizes repeatedly, and what he sees as his own criticism of Husserl, is that the field of appearances is from the start value-laden. It's always a world that is for the sake of, and Patočka says, a world of good and evil. The responsibility that Patočka refers to here is not solely for one's own actions, pragmatic engagement and valuations, but for the very character of the for the sake of. It's the responsibility for the concrete orientation towards the good that a field of appearance and, most importantly perhaps, its infrastructural institutions are oriented toward. My last point here is on the solidarity of the shaken. So amongst those who have undergone the experience of the front as a kind of solidarity, amongst those who have undergone the experience of the front, a kind of solidarity emerges, what Patočka calls the solidarity of the shaken. And this solidarity is of course not based on any political, cultural, or other bonds that would have been bracketed or destroyed at the front. It's rather a community of those who have understood the relation between movement, the coming into being of the world, and others that was revealed as the residuum of the front, or of the epoche. And in this sense, it is a community of phenomenologists. The solidarity of the shaken is also a community of those who have chosen to accept the freedom in responsibility for what should properly be understood as bringing into being a world that could be otherwise in its orientation towards the good, and bearing responsibility for that world. The radical freedom that comes in this sense of responsibility is the freedom of the solidarity of the shaken to remake their individual selves and their communities. If we look back at the earlier analysis of the epoche as care for the soul, we can see that this is precisely the activity that reveals itself as a possibility to the shaken. The responsibility of rebuilding a world is a further development of care for the soul. The task, it would seem, for the solidarity of the shaken is to construct anew a polis where, I quote, Socrates would not be put to death. But this means a polis that maintains the space for the continuous interrogation of the processes of the manifestation of its own institutions. Thank you.